Got it. I tricked it. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Okay. The book is here. I shouldn't need it. All right. Everybody doing okay? Yeah. Wonderful. This isn't too loud, right? Good volume. It's mostly for people online. What can you do? I hope everyone's doing all right. It's good to be with you all. We are still in Esther, which I've determined is very hard to find in the Old Testament. I keep thumbing past it. I've got these big thumbs. We are. I know. Nehemiah, Esther, Job, Psalm, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, but you go too far and it's gone. All right, we're on Esther chapter 8. As you were coming in, there should be a little card. I want to encourage you to grab that card. It'll be something that we use this evening. We'll be in Esther chapter 8 tonight, so that'll be very fun, very good, I guess, hopefully. And then there was the handout as well, which I wanted to talk about for a second. The handout is from a book called The Handbook on the Historical Books. It's by Victor Hamilton. I think he's dead. Isn't that awful? It's like I can't remember or not. He was a longtime professor of biblical stuff at Asbury. So I just want to say something up front about it. I think it's a wonderfully great tool. I use these. It's very succinct, as you can tell. It's like, how many pages? 10 pages or something like that? And that's pretty good for...
It's the whole story of Esther?
No, it's like... it's an introduction. It's like a Bible 101 introduction summary. So it is sort of at a college level, but it's accessible in the fact that it would be like a freshman course, which I think is really good.
Maybe we ought to get that for Sunday school, huh, girls?
Yeah, it could be good. And I try really hard, I'm going to say this so you can hear it from me, I try really hard to balance the perspectives of my handouts, stuff from more like liberally minded folks and stuff from more conservatively minded folks. And I know sometimes people say that and they really don't mean it. But I promise you, if I took you to my library now, you'd be like, oh, he's not kidding. He's got stuff from both sides of the kind of the aisle in terms of spectrum, of kind of scholastic view. So I hope it's helpful. I think it's a great resource. Anything else for this evening? Thank you for the soda. I appreciate that. And we're good to go, right? I got caffeine. It'll be good. All right. Sorry? Oh, passing up? Yeah. All right, so chapter 1, we'll do a little bit of recap, and then we'll do a little bit of prayer, and we'll hop in. Sound good? Yeah. Oh, the card. I should explain what the card is for, shouldn't I? Yeah. The card is for, let me get my notes right. The card is for questions and observations that you have as we're reading. So before we hop in, let me talk a little bit about that. There's something called inductive Bible study that was really big in like the 1970s. How many of you have heard of inductive Bible study? I see one hand. Good. So let me explain. So inductive Bible study has 3 steps. The first one is observe, the second one is interpret, and the third is apply. And so when you do observations, right, you write down observations about the text or about the scripture. So, for example, let's say you were reading Genesis chapter 1. You might write down, I observe that there are 7 days of creation. That's a good observation, right? And then as you're reading, maybe you go into Genesis chapter 2, you could say, I observe that the story of creation started over for some reason, right? That's a good observation. So there's kind of no observation that's too clear. Does that make sense? It's good to make observations. You also want to make questions come up. So you might say something like, I wonder why Mordecai gets the role he gets. That's an interesting question. Or what happens to Esther at the end of chapter 8? That's a good question. You can ask these questions. It's a good thing to ask questions. And so kind of keep track of them on the card as a way to keep them in front of you. We'll hear from some different voices tonight in different translations. Hope that card is helpful for chapter 8. And just a teaser is save some room on the card for maybe additional questions. Sound good? All right, chapter 1, Queen Vashti defies the king. Chapter 2, the beauty contest to find a queen. Chapter 3, Haman and anti-Semitism. Chapter 4, Mordecai and Esther agree to help. Chapter 5, Esther plans. Chapter 6, the king can't sleep. Chapter 7, Haman's downfall.
Oh, yeah.
I thought that was pretty good.
Yay.
You have to pardon the pun, right? Downfall on the gallows. Okay. I have a dark sense of humor sometimes. All right, previously on Esther chapter 7, verse 10. That's right. So they hung Haman on the pole that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the anger of the king abated. Let's offer a word of prayer, and then let's hear from some different translations and voices, shall we? Holy God, we give you thanks for this day. We give you thanks for the book of Esther and being able to gather in this space. We give you thanks for your Spirit that will come and guide us and teach us. So as we encounter these words tonight, we pray that we would have a healthy skepticism of them, a healthy reverence for them, and that in the middle of our questioning, in the middle of our reverence, we would find you. We pray this all in your Son's name. Amen. All right, so I don't know how your editors and your translation chose to chop it up, but like I have a paragraph break between 2 and 3. I have a paragraph break between 8 and 9. I have a paragraph break between 14 and 15. You all have different paragraph breaks in your Bible? Huh. I wonder why. That's an interesting thing. So we'll just stick with what we have up here. And so the different slides will be those breaks.
Write that down, that's one of your questions.
That could be one of our questions. I know, yeah, right? It can get real fun. Why in the world are the paragraph breaks different? So let's hop in. Would someone like to read Esther chapter 8, verses 1 through 2? It can be anybody. It's all right.
That same day, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. When Mordecai came into the presence of the king, for Esther had said how he was related to her, the king took off his signet ring, which he had reclaimed from Haman, and presented it to Mordecai, and Esther appointed him over Haman's estate.
Oh,
Wonderful. And you have the NIV, right, is what I'm seeing you reading?
I didn't realize that.
Good, okay. All right.
Didn't remember that.
Any questions or observations off the bat? We're only 2 verses in.
I felt like the king's pretty free with that signet ring.
Yes.
He was gonna give her half the kingdom, but she got
Uh-huh.
the ring instead.
It's like, okay, he's not using it anymore. You can use it. And I'd be like, no, thank you. So it seems whoever you give it to ends up dead.
I think it's neat the way the author writes the good and the bad and the good.
Mm-hmm.
Keeps crossing along them.
Yeah, it's a good pace of the story. Okay, if you got other questions or observations, feel free to write them down. Let's go again. Verses 3 through 8, a larger chunk here. If someone else would like to read, it can be from any translation. That's okay. Thank you.
Now Esther spoke again to the king, fell down at his feet, and implored him with tears to counteract the evil plot of Haman the Agagite, and the scheme which he had devised against the Jews. And the king held out the golden scepter towards Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king, and said, If it pleases the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and saying seems right to the king, and I am pleasing his eyes, let be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, the son of Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote to annihilate the Jews who are in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the evil that will come to my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred? Then the king Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, Indeed, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and seal it with the king's signet ring, for a letter which is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring. No one can revoke.
Interesting. I'll say what? Except him. That's right. No one can revoke it except for me. I can revoke it,
Well,
said the king.
That's interesting, though. It says, no document written in the king's name and sealed with his ring can be revoked. So how can Haman's be revoked?
Yeah.
Because that was written
It was written and sealed.
Yep.
So,
to the king's ring.
are there takesy backsies? You know?
That's kind of,
somebody read what Haman said and then read again what Esther wanted to say. Is it really the same thing,
You talking about in this particular chapter?
both chapters?
We have to go back and see earlier.
Haman wrote that all the Jews should be killed and annihilated. And
Yes. I think this is in chapter 3. Is that right? Excuse me, I'm going to go back here.
is it that far back?
Yeah, Haman and anti-Semitism. That'd be chapter 3. So somewhere he's going to, and he seals it.
What does he write and what does she write?
Verse 12. Yeah, Haman commanded was written to the king's satraps and to the governors of the provinces and to the officials of all the peoples, every province, yada, yada, yada. It was written in the name of King Osiris and sealed with the king's ring. Letters were sent, yada, 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 to kill, to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. And then verse 13. Verse 14, a copy of the document was to be issued, yep, so on and so forth. So, and we've talked about this too, how the actual wording of that is unclear in chapter 3. But then we did read the letter, which was in Esther chapter 13, which is in the Apocrypha.
Right.
And so here, in this section, chapter 8,
Has she set up a ruling that they will kill all the enemies of the Jews the day before?
no, you're reading ahead. That's not yet.
My commentary says that he couldn't revoke what he said before, and that what he really gave the Jews permission to do was to fight back, was to assemble and gather weapons and be prepared.
Yes. That's a good question.
Yeah, because that's the explanation this gives for why, because he can't revoke it when he said it.
He already said it.
His ring,
That's
so.
what I was saying.
There are a couple other times in the Old Testament.
We aren't this far yet, though, are we?
We're not there yet.
Okay.
It's all right. No, it's okay. It's good. These are good questions, things to wrestle with. Like, how can a king go back on his word? Or maybe another...
How can a president go back on his word?
Right. Or thinking about it this way, are there other people in the Old Testament or New Testament that offer a blessing or offer a word and then cannot revoke it? And immediately I think of Isaac giving his blessing to Jacob and Esau. And he gives his blessing to Jacob, and Esau's like, bless me as well.
Yeah.
And he says, I cannot. So words are different in the ancients' minds, you know? I've heard it said once you say a word, it is manifest and you cannot take it back. So it's interesting. Let's keep going. I think there's a lot of questions, and that's good. I just have some surprises for us this evening, so I want to get to my surprises.
You know, like in children's service?
What? A children's sermon?
Like you have surprises?
Maybe. We'll see. All right. So the couriers, are we on verse, we did 9 through 14, is that right?
Yes.
All right. So 15 through 17. Would someone like to read for us?
We didn't.
We didn't? All right. 9 through 14 then. That's all right.
I'll read it because this is the part I was referring to.
That's all right, yeah.
At once the royal secretaries were summoned. On the 23rd day of the 3rd month, the month of Sivan, they wrote out all Mordecai's orders to the Jews and to the satraps, governors, and nobles of the 127 provinces, stretching from India to Kush. These orders were written in the script of each province and the language of each people, and also to the Jews in their own script and language. Mordecai wrote in the name of King Xerxes, sealed the dispatches with the king's signet ring, and sent them by mounted couriers who rode fast horses, especially bred for the king. The king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate the armed men of any nationality or province who might attack them and their women and children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. The day appointed for the Jews to do this in all the provinces of King Xerxes was the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality, so that the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. The couriers riding the royal horses went out, spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa.
Wonderful. Doing okay? Let's push on. I'll take us to the end. Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king, wearing royal robes of blue and white, with a great golden crown and a mantle of fine linen and purple, while the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. For the Jews there was light and gladness, joy and honor. In every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict came, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a festival and a holiday. Furthermore, many of the peoples of the country professed to be Jews because the fear of the Jews had fallen upon them. Of course, right? You all know Paul Harvey, right? And now, the rest of the story. And so, chapter 9. Interesting. Let's recap so far as we hop into chapter 9. Queen Vashti defies the king. Chapter 2, the beauty contest to find a queen. Chapter 3, Haman and anti-Semitism. Chapter 4, Mordecai and Esther agree to help. Chapter 5, Esther plans. Chapter 6, the king can't sleep. Chapter 7, Haman's downfall. Chapter 8, the Jews defended themselves. Maybe you come up with a different summary?
Well, they're given permission to do that.
Yeah, they're getting ready to. Shall we read?
Sure.
Chapter 9, 1 through 10. Is it all right if I lead us for a second here? This is a long, lengthy chapter. Now in the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, on the 13th day, when the king's command and edict were about to be executed, on the very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain power over them, but which had been changed to a day when the Jews would gain power over their foes, the Jews gathered in their cities through all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who had sought their ruin, and no one could withstand them, because the fear of them had fallen upon all the peoples. All the officials of the provinces, the satraps and the governors, and the royal officials were supporting the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai had fallen upon them. For Mordecai was powerful in the king's house, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces of the man. Mordecai grew more and more powerful. So the Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, slaughtering and destroying them, and did as they pleased to those who hated them. In the citadel of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 people. They killed Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Poratha, Adalia, Aridatha, Parmastha, Arisai, Aridae, Vizatha.
Or cities.
That's a great question. Are they people or cities? They're probably people, because here's the next one. The 10 sons of Haman, son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, but they did not touch the plunder. Questions so far? Observations?
Why not?
That's supposed to get you a gold medal, because, I mean, you kill all these people, but you won't plunder.
That's right, yeah. It's interesting, like why...
Is that redemption or something? Or
Well, it's a very interesting addition or an interesting detail of the text, you know? So sometimes a question we can ask is, what is the significance of not touching the plunder? And is there a significance for us to understand about that? It can lead to some interesting research and digging around and sort of fiddling about.
Well, sometimes God said, kill everything and everybody and take no plunder. And other times he would say, take the plunder.
Mm-hmm. And apparently, well,
He told them they could have it. That was part of it.
yeah, but we'll notice too that there's no direct voice of God in chapter 9 telling them what to do with the plunder or to kill.
Well, I think that a plunder could be used by someone later on down the road. I don't know.
Or it could be a reference back, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, where they just take a life and not take
More than the life.
more than a life.
That's a bad bet.
Well, if you're confused, that's okay. You know, it's the book of Esther ends very interestingly, and so we're gonna keep going. Sound good? 11 through 15. That very day, the number of those who killed in the citadel of Susa was reported to the king. The king said to Queen Esther, "In the citadel of Susa, the Jews have killed 500 people, and also the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your petition? It shall be granted you. And what further is your request? It shall be fulfilled." Esther said, "If it pleases the king, let the Jews who are in Susa be allowed tomorrow also to do according to this day's edict. And let the 10 sons of Haman be hanged on the gallows." So the king commanded this to be done. A decree was issued in Susa, and the 10 sons of Haman were hanged. The Jews who were in Susa gathered also on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they killed 300 persons in Susa, but they did not touch the plunder. Good? Yeah. I had an Old Testament professor. He's a brilliant man. He's written books on Hosea and Jonah and other things. His name's Dr. Andy Dearman. I think he's retired now. He's the dean. And he would make us, when we were sitting in the Old Testament, and he's teaching us about, Hebrew in the Bible, and he goes, "Nod your head. There is sanctioned killing in the Bible." Right? And you would go, "Uh-huh." And he goes, "And I don't know what to do about that," right? You go, "Okay, Dr. Dearman," Yeah, he got his PhD from Tübingen in Germany, and so it's a fantastic institution. And if Dr. Dearman says, "I don't know what to do about it," then I'm not sure we're going to know what to do about it either. So it's helpful to have some humility around it. 16 through 17. Would someone else like to read for a different change of voice and pace? Just 2 verses here, 16 and 17. Yeah, nice and loud.
I'm not reading from the Bible, this other book.
No, wonderful. The story, which is a paraphrase, I think. Yeah, it'll be interesting to hear it.
Okay, meanwhile, the remainder of the Jews, that the one we're on, who were in the king's provinces, also assembled to protect themselves and get relief from their enemies. They killed 75,000 of them, but did not lay their hands on the plunder. This happened on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th they rested and made a day of feasting and joy.
That's good. I mean, that's terrible, but thank you for reading it. You notice not the juxtaposition, but an interesting thing is, they killed 75,000 people, and what do? Feasting and gladness. Just something, we'll talk about it, right? But hold that in your hearts. I don't know, hold that in your head. Something to chew on.
Did it say they feasted?
It does. Yep.
It was joy.
Feasted and gladness. Okay. Thank you. Verse 18 and 19. Would someone like to read for us, a different voice? I'm happy to. I'll do it. It's me. I'll do it. But the Jews who were in Susa gathered on the 13th day and on the 14th and rested on the 15th day, making that day of feasting and gladness. Therefore, the Jews of the villages who live in the open towns hold the 14th day of the month of Adar as a day for gladness and feasting, a holiday on which they send gifts of food to one another. Let's push on. 20 through 23. Mordecai recorded these things and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, enjoining them that they should keep the 14th day of the month Adar and also the 15th day of the same month, year by year, as the days on which the Jews gained relief from their enemies, and as the month that had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness, and from mourning into a holiday, that they should make these make them days of feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food to one another and presents to the poor. So the Jews adopted as a custom what they had begun to do, as Mordecai had written to them. 24 through 28. Why stop there, right? There's still more. Let's go. Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them and to cast pur, that is, the lot, to crush and destroy them. But when Esther came before the king, he gave orders in writing that the wicked plot that he had devised against the Jews should come upon his own head, and that he and his sons would be hanged on the gallows. Therefore, these days are called Purim, from the word pure. Thus, because of all that was written in this letter, and of what they had faced in this matter, and of what had happened to them, the Jews established and accepted as a custom for themselves and their descendants and all who joined them, that without fail they would continue to observe these 2 days every year, as it was written and at the time appointed. These days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, in every family, province, and city. And these days of Purim should never fall into disuse among the Jews, nor should the commemoration of these days cease among their descendants.
Just for the heck of it, what is the month of Adar in comparison to us?
Someone write that question down. I don't know if you heard it. What is the month of Adar in comparison to us? And I am 90% sure that we've talked about that, and I'm going to have to refer to my notes, which I have. So we'll go back and look. I think we talked about it in chapter 1 or 2, maybe around then. Does that vaguely sound familiar to some of you? Okay. And sorry, this is just a brief aside. I feel like that projector's getting ready to take off.
It would be
Just
interesting if it concorded with what's going on now.
It would be interesting. Okay. And it was recorded in writing. Where are we at? Verse 29. Yeah. Hey, we're almost done with chapter 9. This is good. Y'all don't seem as excited as I am. You know. Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, along with the Jew Mordecai, gave full written authority, confirming the second letter about Purim. Letters were sent wishing peace and security to all the Jews, to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, and giving orders that these days of Purim should be observed at their appointed seasons. As the Jew Mordecai and Queen Esther enjoined on the Jews, just as they had laid down for themselves and for their descendants regulations concerning their fasts and their lamentations, the command of Queen Esther fixed these practices of Purim, and it was recorded in writing. And thus finishes chapter 9, and we are done for the evening. I'm kidding, right? As Paul Harvey would say, and now the rest of the story. We only got a few verses left. Why stop there? We should finish the book. Chapter 1. Queen Vashti defies the king. Chapter 2, the beauty contest to find a queen. Chapter 3, Haman and anti-Semitism. Chapter 4, Mordecai and Esther agree to help. Chapter 5, Esther plans. Chapter 6, the king can't sleep. Chapter 7, Haman's downfall. Chapter 8, the Jews defend themselves. Chapter 9, the Jews win and create Purim. Chapter 10. Buckle up, buttercup. Here we go. There ain't very many. How many verses are there? 3.
And that's it?
That's it.
Boy, we don't want to wait 2 weeks.
No, certainly not. King Ahasuerus laid tribute on the land and on the islands of the sea, all the acts of his power and might, and the full account of the high honor of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him. Are they not written in the annals of the king of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was next in rank to King Ahasuerus, and he was powerful among the Jews, and popular with many kindred, for he sought the good of his people and interceded for the welfare of all his descendants.
That's it?
That's it. Yay!
Google says Adar fits with our February or March.
Okay.
Interesting. Coming up in the winter. Thanks for looking that up. We did it. We read a whole book of the Bible, right? That's good. So if you've been with us in worship, right, we finished James. If you've been here, we've finished Jonah, Mark, Ruth, and Esther. That's 5. All right, if we get one more, then if we get one more, then we're at 10% of the Bible. That's pretty good.
It's
Yeah.
a little short.
They're little short
What is
ones.
it, 59 verse or 119 verses.
Yeah. But hey, they count. Okay, so what I want to do for the remaining 15-ish, 20 minutes or so is I want to ask some good questions with you all. And so I want to pull back a little bit and let's focus on 8, 9, and 10 a little bit. And what I want to do this week is ask the questions, make some observations. Next week, I want to answer those questions and those observations. And the final week, which will be November 15th, is I want to talk about Purim. I want to talk about what threads do we see throughout the entire story of Esther, and how can we have a synopsis of the story in a way that we understand it, maybe from a historical perspective, and then how can we understand it for our faith today? Or what might Esther teach us would be another question to ask. The Jews do get even. Okay, so what observations, questions, and comments have you written down? And let's see if there's some good synergy in the room. Talk nice and loud so maybe my mic can pick you up for those online. If not, I'll repeat the questions. And if I don't repeat the question, say, Josh, you need to repeat the question. And I'll say, that's right, I do, thank you. What questions did you come up with? And they don't have to be sequential questions in 8, 9, and 10, but or observations might you have?
Well, I have a question.
Yes.
Why would the Jews not be prepared to defend themselves before the second degree? I mean, if they knew somebody was coming after them to kill them, I don't understand why they would not be trying to prepare, like, okay, the king says you're going to be killed, so I'll just stand here and be killed. That doesn't make sense.
Yeah, the question was, why would the Jews not be prepared to defend themselves? Yeah, it's a great question. I'm going to try really hard to not give an answer to all these questions, right? Because I do think there's some things that come to mind, but I'm going to hold that and sort of just and sit on it for a moment. So it's a great question. What other questions and observations did you see?
I want to know if, were the 75,000 people that were slaughtered actually fighting the Jews, or were they just going into homes and killing people just because they weren't Jews?
Yep.
And I find myself hostile to this book also.
Perfect. You're not alone. Yeah. So she asked, what about the 75,000 people who were just slaughtered by the Jews? Were they actually combatants and fighting, or were they innocents? And then the comment, you find yourself hostile to the book. And if you read the handout that I gave, there are a number of people throughout church history who do not like this book, which is a fantastic question in and of itself. And we've talked about this. Why is it in here?
I think that's why it wasn't in the Bible itself.
Yes.
And they don't talk about God, and you wonder, would God have endorsed this?
Uh-huh.
It just seems so.
Did God sanction all that killing, or was it just the king?
Oh, here we go now. Here we go. This is good. So who sanctioned the killing?
Yeah.
Was it God or was it
Kings are,
politics?
yeah.
I mean, it's just... Okay, and then another question. Is there a difference in the ancients' mind? Is there a difference between the king and God? And, sorry?
I don't think they've used it that way.
Yeah, they may not have. And then just another question, we could piddle with this a little bit, and, is there a difference today? And do people sometimes get confused or conflate the two? And is maybe Esther trying to teach us something, maybe about the dangers of sanctioned killing? I don't know, right? Okay, so I'm not going to preach too much. I'm just going to ask these questions here. So what was our question again? Did God sanction the killing or the king?
Was it God or the king that sanctioned the killing?
Well,
And the king is so influential. I mean,
Yep.
influenced by others.
yeah. So
He
easily
doesn't have
easily
any
influenced.
stand on anything. Oh, you want to do that? Okay, I'll write, you
Yeah.
write the edict, here's my ring. Oh, you want to negate that? Here's my ring. Write the edict and do it. I mean,
But whatever the king facts that people follow? Question mark.
Yeah.
Meaning that, oh, they were all ready to kill the Jews, and then all of a sudden the edict changes, and now they're, what, scared, step down,
know.
becoming Jews, so they can what, follow what the king decreed?
Yeah, there's a thread there that I think is interesting. One is the king is apparently okay with killing his own people, which we could say, yeah, you look at history, and that's totally happened, you know. However, I'm going to assume that he's killing off a large portion of his tax base, and that's a bad business move, you know. So I just find that interesting. And then you mentioned that there was sort of this, the word in the text is this like fear of the Jews. Did you catch that little? It's mentioned a couple times. It's fear of Jews and fear of Mordecai, and
They became Jews because fear of the Jews.
and I'm curious about this idea. Like, are they afraid of the Jews? Are they afraid of the king? Are they afraid of Mordecai? Because he's apparently by chapter 10, it's like king and Mordecai. Yeah, and so that's interesting. You could have some questions about that or some observations. But I'm going to write down the fear of the Jews is an interesting term.
This is just an observation, no question. Just seems like Esther was really patient. She was biding her time, and once she got her dad in there, the ball started rolling. I think they had a plan in mind, and that she had to get all of her ducks in a row, and use her beauty and her status with the king, and she used it to the fullest to get her dad
Yeah.
where he wanted to be.
Yeah, it's a wonderful observation, I think, about the role of Esther in the story. And then the handout it talks about, right, there's only 2 books in the Old Testament. No, 2 books in the entire Bible, right, written that have a woman's name, Ruth and Esther. And so your observation, I think, is right on that, like, she's very patient. She has a pivotal role to play. And I think, in some regards, another observation we can make is that the book of Esther bucks the trend of other female characters, but not always.
She's not a minor player.
She's not.
But is she making these requests, or is Mordecai telling her to make these requests?
No, it's a great question.
No, Mordecai just tells her to go.
To ask for another day of killing.
That's a wonderful question. I don't know if y'all heard it. How could she be so cruel as to ask for another day of killing? So, let's sit with that uncomfort for a little bit, right? And realize I'm just going to make some observations or some statements that we can think about and go, I'm not sure where I'm going with my thoughts yet. So bear with me as I process some of this, right? We live in 2023, and the farthest I am away from a war that was approved by Congress would be World War II, right? Now, there's been other armed conflicts, and we've all had those in our lives. And then I have family that's served in armed conflicts, and armed conflicts is different from, like, civil unrest and violence. And I'm not talking about, like, January 6th insurrection or other sort of civil unrest or Ferguson riots. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking like they're in the streets murdering people, you know? So I think we're pretty far removed from the text in terms of the violence that we see perpetrated upon the innocents in the text. But in the Bible itself, that theme is in a few different places. Help me here. Let's brainstorm where we sort of see
Well, what about
Joshua.
Joshua, yep, the promised land, what we're saying?
No, what I started saying was what's going on right now with Israel.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yep.
I mean, there's killing on both sides there. Now Israel's going in and killing people on the other side, and to what end? I mean, the fact that they got attacked, does that justify retaliation to the extent,
Yes, I know exactly what, yeah. It's a beautiful question.
two wrongs make a right, I
Uh-huh.
the same.
Yeah.
But if you don't, if you don't let them know that you can take care of yourself, they will continue.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, this is great, and I'm not sure we have enough time to pursue all these rabbit trails, and they're not genuinely rabbit trails, right? They are huge, huge moral questions, and ones that we see Jesus teach about. So think about what Jesus, it might be just good to go home tonight, and if you're like, I'm curious, just read the Sermon on the Mount. Just read Matthew chapter 5 and then go, what in the world? Jesus is talking about do not resist an evil person. Blessed are the peacemakers. And you're exactly right. There's a good tradition within the a good tradition in the Christian worldview that would say there's a justification for violence at times, for going to war. Is there such thing as justified violence? Otherwise, you'll keep getting pushed around.
Okay, well, we didn't get in the war to save the Jews. We got into the war because we were bombed at Pearl Harbor.
That's correct, from one perspective, and I don't disagree with you. Oh, there we go. Yeah, there you go. Yeah. Okay. So I think we're far removed from the violence that we've seen, and think about it from the ancient perspective as best we can. Let's try to transport ourselves back into that ancient of days and put ourselves in their sandals. This sort of killing, I think, happened frequently. It was a pretty violent place. There were certainly periods of peace and prosperity in the ancient world, but there's a great philosopher, and I'm going to butcher the quote now, but what's the quote is history is short, violent, and brutish. I think that's very true, right? The average lifespan today is 72.5 years. That's the mortality table. And the average lifespan of someone living in 600 BC was not 70. Yeah. If you were 30, you were ancient. You were an old man or an old woman.
You were at the age of wisdom.
Yeah. Okay. So,
One more question.
yep.
So this chapter ends without any more on Esther. Is there another place in the Bible that continues Esther at all?
Well, I think the technical answer to that question is it depends. Yeah. To be
Is she mentioned anywhere?
precise, she's not mentioned elsewhere. She's not quoted in the New Testament,
No.
and she's not mentioned elsewhere. There are other chapters to Esther that we've talked about that are found in the Apocrypha, and that's something to consider.
Is Purim mentioned other places? Because I don't remember.
I don't believe, so the question was, is Purim mentioned elsewhere? I'm going to write it down. I don't think so. Because some people will say that's the whole entire point of Esther. Is that, they had Purim. Why in the world do they have this whole entire thing? Oh, Esther. And during Purim, we'll talk about this, they read the whole book of Esther. Similar to the Festival of Booths, they read the whole book of Ruth. Is Purim mentioned elsewhere? What else? What other questions and observations might we have?
Purim is just celebrating killing all these people.
No.
I'm sorry?
Purim is just celebrating killing all these people.
Okay.
Purim celebrates life.
Well,
Living,
no.
surviving.
So let's take this question and say, what is Purim celebrating exactly?
Yeah, that's what I
Uh-huh.
Survival.
And we can talk about it. For Lot. P-U-R, yeah, for Lot. And we've talked about that a little bit too, some of the etymology of that term. I want to stick here. I want to sit in this space. If you're feeling a little uneasy, maybe you're not. Maybe you're bored, or maybe you're okay. I'm not sure. But I feel a little uneasy, and I think it's good to sit in this space, because then you begin to kind of pull back some layers. So like, why do we celebrate Halloween? I mean, it's a good question, you know? Like, did you know that Thursday is named after Thor? Thor's Day? And so every Thursday we celebrate the god of thunder,
Yeah.
you know? But like, my kids don't know that. And of course, we've talked about this, that the Jewish calendar is a lunar-based calendar, and we're on a Gregorian calendar, which of course was changed by the Roman Empire. And so are there really 12 months to a year? No, because August and July were added to commemorate, you know, emperors. Yeah. And so these months actually don't really exist. I mean, they kind of do because we celebrate them and they're in the calendar and I can point to them, but they're made up. They're made up. And so Purim, well, that's interesting. They killed a crap ton of people. But we should celebrate it as a victory over our oppressors. Well, how do the oppressors view that? You know?
They were dead.
And to put the shoe on the other foot, we do this all the time. We do it all the time. And it causes a lot of frustration for people, right? Let's broaden our scope. Christopher Columbus Day. How is that viewed for the native people? Well, they don't really like Christopher Columbus. Okay, well, I like Christopher Columbus because I'm here and I'm an American. You know, that's good for me and I get the day off of school. So what's wrong with that? You know, well, that's a complicated holiday. And Thanksgiving the same way. What's Christmas? Christmas is about the winter solstice. It's about a pagan god. Also, we just say Jesus was born that day. No, he wasn't. No, he wasn't, but maybe he was. And I'm not trying to rock your faith. I'm just trying to say these are good questions to ask. So Purim, right? So what do they really commemorate and honor? And what is it about? And maybe that depends on which rabbi is preaching that day. And maybe it's about victory over their oppressors, as it was in Egypt. Or maybe it's about liberating from a foreign power. Well, that has political undertones to it. Okay. And maybe you should read the Maccabees while we're at it, during the Christmas, because that's all about victory over oppressors. And while I'm at it, and while you all got me going, you know, you got Judas Iscariot, and you got another zealot. And what's a zealot? It's someone who's zealous. And what they believe is that this Messiah, we talked about this with the Gospel of Mark, they believe that a Messiah is going to come, and that the Messiah is going to usher in David's kingdom and overthrow the Roman Empire. Well, if you overthrow an empire, that's by the sword. Empires rarely crumble from just within, and of course some do. But for the most part, they're conquered. They are conquered. And that's a political statement. And so can you really tease out someone's individualistic piety? I'm a Jew. I'm a good Jew. I go to synagogue and I keep kosher and I read Torah. And I think people would say, you also have a political role to play in this. Have you not read the Old Testament? Okay, just something to think about. Sorry about that. And a little bit of an aside.
So from a modern day perspective, it would be interesting for people to know what happened with Hitler and what he did when they tried to celebrate Purim during his regime.
Oh, interesting. I don't know if y'all heard, what about Hitler and celebrating Purim during his regime? And there's some stories there. That's interesting, you know? And like, I mean, do you just hear the story of Esther in history, right? And an edict came that they should kill all the Jews. I know this story. Are we in the right century? Let me find it in this old dusty book. Oh, here it is. This isn't 1940s. This is Esther. For such a time as this. What else? Other observations and questions. It can be about 8, 9, and 10 are about the whole, but we got a few questions going on so far. Oh gosh, we got like 5 minutes left. Just curious. What else do you have? What else did you write down? Other questions or observations you might have had?
What do we do with this book? What is it trying to tell us?
Yeah, what do we do
How
with
is it
this?
trying to inform our faith?
Yeah, I think I've shared before, and I've been formed by a mentor of mine who said you can always ask 2 questions of the Bible. What does this teach us about God, and what does it teach us about ourselves? And if you can answer those 2 questions, I think you're doing the Bible justice. And what does it teach us about God? And that's a really tough question to ask of Esther.
Because he's not mentioned.
Right. And that's okay. Or is it? I think the church has said that's okay. And by the church, I mean the historical, universal, Orthodox church has said it's okay that God's not mentioned in the book. And that's why it's here. What else? Other observations and questions? What did you write down? Yeah, go ahead.
Talks about, and many people of other nationalities became Jews because fear of the Jews had seized them. So they say, I'm a Jew.
Yeah, I had a question about that too. There seems to be some conversion taking place. And we know from other books in the Apocrypha in particular that there are a lot of people who converted to Judaism because of the fear of the Jews. So I think that's connected. I think it's connected. I'm unsure. I've not studied it enough. And so, and last I checked, when you converted to Judaism, it was not an easy process, especially for men. You know, it's a little bit of something you got to go through. And if you're an adult male, I mean, they really didn't have like Neosporin. So, you know, you're gonna die. You're gonna die. So, interesting things. Very good. All pictures next week. No, okay. What else? Other questions that you might have written down or comments, thoughts? Just keep it going. It's all right. I had questions about Mordecai rising to office. I wondered if that's attested in other places. You know, sometimes we'll get an extra biblical resource, like we did when we were studying the Gospel of Mark, and we found things that talked about Pontius Pilate that were not in the text. So you can begin to say, they probably didn't make it up. You know what I mean?
Did Mordecai have a different name than Mordecai?
Well, that's a great question.
Because,
Mordecai, does he have a different name?
you know, there's a lot of, there's so many kings and prophets and people in the Bible where the name is used over and over and over.
And we've already seen that with King Ahasuerus or King Xerxes and the language that's borrowed from Persia. And so the names could be different. And just because we can't find Mordecai chiseled in stone doesn't mean he didn't exist. You know, but it's just a question I had, you know, like he rose to prominence. You know, he's second in command according to Esther. And we know that generals had arches made after them for great victories.
But we don't really know how long his greatness lasted.
We don't.
It may have been a year and a half.
Yeah, you're exactly right. What else? Other questions or comments or observations?
Xerxes went out of power. Mordecai might have preceded him.
So if his provinces, or satraps were from India to Ethiopia,
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't he have a lot of different names because
Yeah.
Just
the
the
different locations?
yeah, the vast geography of the empire.
172 provinces.
Yep.
Anyway,
127, sorry.
you said there weren't any vowels in, there weren't any vowels in the, so.
In Hebrew, yeah, there are no vowels in the original.
Was it Mordecai at all?
Yeah. No, I mean, you're not wrong. And we can begin to see some of the difficulty in these questions. And maybe some of the healthy posture of saying we may never know. And I think some people are more comfortable with that than others. You know, some people really want to know. And so, you know, it's okay. I just think that there's good questions to ask there. Okay, other questions? Good? Yep.
Okay, I'm not a scholar, but it kind of makes me wonder, why were we given the Ten Commandments? Because we just seem to break them all over the place, depending on, okay, you're not supposed to kill, but it depends on who you're killing. Or you're not supposed to covet, but that all depends on,
What you cover.
you know.
Well,
We've just got all kinds of people through the Bible breaking these commandments, they're not suggestions.
well, what's interesting is your observation about that is also mentioned in Esther, whether or not we want to admit it. So let me see if I can find the verse. You'll bear with me. So this is in 927. This is how I read it, right? The Jews established and accepted as custom for themselves and their descendants, all who joined them, that without fail they would continue to observe these 2 days every year, as it was written and at that time appointed. These days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation and every family, province, and city. That verse alone talks about the importance of do not forget this book. There are other places, in Deuteronomy in particular, right? And I shared this, and I got to do it from memory. It's Deuteronomy chapter 6, and it says, Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. And then it goes on in Deuteronomy chapter 6 and talks about land that you were given, that you did not work for, talking about the promised land. And then it says, You shall remember the teachings of the Lord. They shall be like initials on your forehead, and you should carve them onto the doorposts of your home. You should teach them to your children. Remember them as you walk about your day, and do not forget the Lord your God. And there is this resonance of calling the people to remember what God has already said. So I think your question is really apt, you know. We have these 10 commandments, we keep breaking them. It's like people just can't, they keep forgetting what they've been told over and over and over again.
But it seems in certain instances it's okay to do this.
In particular, too, just avoid the whole entire one about murdering and stealing and...
Well, I mean, look at David and Bathsheba.
Uh-huh. Well, you know, he's king.
The whole bunch right there.
He's king. He's king. So another question I heard you say, like, I'm going to write down, you can see how my brain works. Is it okay to break the 10 Commandments? And I think, like, for some people, it seems like they feel like they are above it, you know?
Very much so.
Yeah.
Everything that, this paper that was put out, where they're saying that so many people are hostile to this book, I wonder how this book got in the Bible.
I
Yeah.
brought that question up.
Yeah, the question was how did it get in the Bible? And the answer, right, the answer is, that's a long answer. It's a long story. And we've talked a little bit about it. I did have some handouts about how it was included and why. And at the end of the day, none of us were there, you know. But there are some reasons why it was included. And I wish I could just say, well, it satisfies criteria A, B, and C. The criteria at times seems a little fuzzy to all of us in this space.
Something's got to explain for him.
Yep.
That's why it's in there.
Back up first.
I do remember you asking that, but, it just makes me think, I would think that like a lot of people might feel that books in the Bible are there from influence
So yeah, right, and
something.
in the handout, I think you've seen, right, Luther thought that the New Testament was buried in the Old Testament, and so the reason really why the Old Testament even exists is to point us to Jesus. That's a very Reformation idea. That's very much what Luther believed. It's probably what Calvin believed. And I've literally thought about this conversation. If Martin Luther was standing right here and he rose from the dead, I would say, bro, you're wrong. You know, I would say, you're wrong, and I'm sorry. You feel that way. And Martin Luther's a pretty smart guy, so it's pretty arrogant of me to say that, quite frankly. But I think he's wrong. I don't think the Old Testament only exists just to point to Jesus. I think it does that. But it existed before the New Testament. And it didn't exist to say, we're only writing this stuff down to point to Jesus.
It's the history of our
Yeah, and
religion.
I might start preaching a little bit too. Even the New Testament, right? It points away from itself. It doesn't even just point to Jesus. It points to God and the Spirit and the Trinity. And so Luther, like, come on, bro. God the Father, God the Son, God the Spirit is not all about just Jesus. Even Jesus points away from himself. It says, if you know me, you know the Father. So Jesus isn't even pointing to Jesus. Jesus is pointing away from himself. Wake up, bro. I get a little frustrated with him. Sorry, my rant's probably over. But it's interesting that some people think that the only reason the Old Testament exists is to point to Jesus. I think that that's, I'll say, a narrow view of the Old Testament. I have a much broader perspective. I think it points to God. I think it points to Jesus. And I think it points to God's Spirit moving in the world. So I think that there are other criteria and reasons why it exists. So, okay, I'm going to offer a word of prayer. And I'm not sure what I'm going to pray about, but we'll figure it out.
That we all come back next
That's right, yeah. And then I'll linger if you've got any other questions or comments. Holy God, thank you for this time together. I give you thanks for this group of people who are willing to look at a couple chapters in the Bible and say, I don't know, and get frustrated and wrestle with it and have open and honest and heartfelt conversation about where you are in the middle of it. Lord, I pray that in our questioning we would encounter you in new and fantastic ways, and that our faith would deepen and grow because of it as well. Bring us rest this evening as we go back to our homes. May we gather again on Sunday to remember those who passed and the work of your saints. We pray this all in your Son's name. Amen.